My name is Jeffrey, and I'm here to share the story of my life. My wife, Brenda, and I met in college. She was my first real love, the kind that made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. While others were still trying to figure out their paths, we believed we had ours all planned out. Instead of waiting, we jumped in headfirst, marrying young, full of optimism. A year later, we welcomed our daughter, Christine. Those early years were special. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. Life was simple: work, home, raising Christine, and dreaming about the future. I won't pretend it was perfect, but it was good. There were challenges, of course. Bills to pay, late-night arguments, moments of exhaustion and frustration. But no matter how bad things got, we always found our way back to each other. We had an unspoken understanding that we were solid, that no matter what, we were in this together. And that's where I made my first mistake. I assumed that the years we had built together meant we were safe, that familiarity alone was enough to keep us strong. I never imagined I'd have to worry about losing the woman I had built my entire world around. When you spend nearly 2 decades with someone, it's easy to believe they'll always be there. But time has a way of making people drift apart, and when you don't see the distance growing, it blindsides you when it finally hits. In the last 2 years, something shifted. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly started to feel forced, like an obligation rather than a connection. Small disagreements turned into full-blown conflicts. Things we used to laugh about suddenly became serious issues. At first, I convinced myself it was just a rough patch. Every marriage has them. But rough patches don't usually last for years. We tried to fix it. I wanted to believe that nearly 2 decades of marriage couldn't unravel so easily. We went on vacation, hoping a change of scenery would help, and for a little while it did. Sitting on a beach, sipping cocktails, pretending everything was fine. It was easy to believe we were okay. But vacations end, and every time we came home, the same problems were still there, waiting for us like we had just pressed pause instead of actually solving them. So we tried therapy. That felt like a real step in the right direction, at least at first. Sitting with a professional, talking through our problems, it gave me hope. I truly believed this was what we needed, a way to untangle the mess we had become. Then, one day during a session, Brenda casually mentioned that she had reconnected with an old friend. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? We were adults, after all. People stay in touch with old friends all the time. I had no reason to be suspicious. I didn't realize then that this old friend would become the wedge that finally drove us apart. Brenda started keeping her phone closer, angling the screen away when I walked by. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to see the faint glow of her screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard. "Who are you texting?" I asked one night, my voice thick with sleep. She barely looked up. "Mark. He's going through a rough time." That became her go-to excuse, and I wanted to believe her, because the alternative, the idea that my wife of 19 years was emotionally invested in another man, was too much to bear. Then came the defensiveness. If I so much as questioned how often they talked, I became the villain. "It's not like that," she'd snap, rolling her eyes like I was some insecure teenager. "You're being paranoid." But I wasn't jealous. I was watching my wife slip away, piece by piece, pouring parts of herself into someone else while treating me like a nuisance. Our conversations grew shorter. Looking back, I should have confronted it head-on. But when you build a life with someone, you don't want to believe they're capable of betraying you. And before you even realize it, the marriage you thought was unshakable is already falling apart, and you're the only one trying to hold it together. Mark was Brenda's high school boyfriend. They had been together for a few years back when love was about passing notes in class and sneaking phone calls after curfew. But life took them in different directions. She went to college and he pursued his own path. From what little she had told me, their breakup wasn't dramatic. They simply drifted apart. It wasn't some tragic love story, just 2 teenagers who moved on. That should have been the end of it. But decades later, out of nowhere, Mark found his way back into our lives. It started with a message. He had just gone through a divorce and apparently needed Brenda's advice. At first, it seemed harmless, just 2 old friends catching up. That's what she told me, and I wanted to believe her. But as the days passed, Mark's presence in our marriage started to grow, quietly, like a slow leak in the ceiling that goes unnoticed until the damage is too big to ignore. The moment I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't just an innocent reconnection came one night when I found her on her phone again. By then, it had become routine. I made a light-hearted comment, something casual, something along the lines of, "Must be an interesting conversation." Brenda's reaction was immediate, sharp, like I had just accused her of something terrible. She snapped at me, instantly defensive. That night, I had reached my limit. I met her eyes and told her directly, "End it. No more pretending." I don't know. I expected pushback, an argument, maybe even a guilty excuse. But what she said instead sent a cold chill through me. She laughed, and then, in a steady, almost indifferent voice, she said, "I think Mark is my true soulmate. I was meant to be with him." I don't know how long I sat there. A minute, an hour. My mind refused to process her words. How do you respond when the woman you built a life with, the one you sacrificed for, the one you shared a home with, tells you she was never really yours? That everything you had together was a mistake? Just a wrong turn? I had always believed that no matter how difficult things got, we would work through them together. But in that moment, I realized something painful. She had already left. Not physically, not yet, but in her heart, she was long gone, and I had been too blind to see it. But what truly shattered me, the moment that left a wound deeper than anything Brenda had said, was what happened next. Christine had been in the next room. She had heard everything. She walked in. I turned to her, desperate for some kind of support, hoping she would look at her mother in shock, in disbelief. Maybe even ask how she could say something so heartless. But instead, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected, calm, almost sympathetic. And then she said, "Mom deserves to be with the person she truly loves. You wouldn't want her to be unhappy, right?" My own daughter, the child I had raised, protected, and provided for. She wasn't upset. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She looked at me like I was the problem. Something inside me snapped. The pain. The betrayal. It was too much. If my wife saw me as a mistake, and my daughter thought of me as an afterthought, then what was left to fight for? The day I walked into the courtroom for the final divorce hearing, I felt nothing. People always talk about fighting for their marriage, for their family. But what's the point of fighting when the war is already over? Brenda had chosen Mark. Christine had made it clear where she stood. So instead of dragging myself through a pointless battle, I did the only thing that made sense. I let go. I filed for divorce myself. I wasn't going to wait for Brenda to do it on her terms. When it came time to divide everything, I made it simple. She wanted monthly alimony? Fine. Take a lump sum. Take whatever assets were fair. I had no interest in dragging things out over furniture or bank accounts. Christine was already an adult. There was no child support to argue over. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being done. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I could have given a long speech about betrayal, about how nearly 2 decades of marriage had been rewritten as nothing more than a mistake. But I wasn't going to waste my breath explaining my pain to people who had already made up their minds. So I kept it short. I looked straight ahead and said, "If my wife wants to be with him, and my daughter believes I was never enough, then I won't stand in their way." That was it. No pleading. No theatrics. Just the truth. On paper, it might have looked like I was abandoning them, walking away from my responsibilities as a husband and father. But in reality, I was setting myself free. At first, Christine didn't take it seriously. She assumed I was just angry, that I needed time to cool off. In her mind, this was temporary, a punishment I was handing down to her and Brenda for what they had done. She figured that, like always, I would come back, that no matter what, I would still be the dad she could depend on. She still expected my calls, my check-ins. Most of all, she expected my financial support. In her head, nothing had really changed. Maybe she even convinced herself that once I got over it, things would go back to normal. But normal didn't exist anymore. Weeks passed, then months, and I didn't call. I didn't check in. I didn't send a single dime. At first, She probably thought I was just proving a point, trying to make her feel guilty. But then reality set in. The bills kept coming. Tuition payments were still due. The small luxuries she had always taken for granted? Gone. And when she tried to reach me, nothing. The number she called was no longer in service. The messages she left went unanswered. She even went to my old place, only to find a stranger living there. That's when she realized I was really gone. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. And for the first time in her life, she had to face a reality she had never even considered. A world where Dad wasn't the safety net. A world where the man she had so easily dismissed wasn't there to clean up the mess. Mark wasn't her father. He was just a man her mother used to love. Someone who had lived his own life before suddenly reappearing. Christine had assumed he would simply step into the role I had left behind. But that's not how it works. A father isn't replaceable. There's no plug-and-play option when you decide to throw one away. And when desperation set in, she did the only thing she could. She kept calling. Over and over again. I saw the missed calls. I read the messages. But I never replied. Not out of spite. Not to hurt her. I simply had nothing left to give. A year passed before she finally tracked me down. I don't know how she did it, but one day, there she was. She apologized. Said she had never truly considered my side of things. Admitted she was wrong for treating me like I was nothing more than an obstacle in her mother's way. And I believed her. But believing isn't the same as forgetting. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I simply met her eyes and told her the truth. Go be with your mother and the man she chose. I saw the exact moment she understood. Understood that there was no place for her in that life. That no one would ever love her the way I had. And that even love has its limits. Keeping in touch with Christine isn't the same anymore. There was a time when she'd call me for anything. Money for school, advice about life, even just to vent about her mother. Back then, I always answered. No hesitation. No second thoughts. But now I hesitate. Now I think before I pick up. I keep my guard up, not because I want to, but because I have to. The hard truth is, I don't fully trust her yet. I want to. But trust isn't something that just snaps back into place like a broken rubber band. When someone you love looks you in the eye and chooses someone else's happiness over yours, something inside you shifts. She sided with her mother when I was at my lowest. And even though she's apologized, even though she wants to mend things, I can't pretend it never happened. Words don't erase wounds. Time doesn't either. Only actions do. So now we stay in contact. But on my terms. No more unlimited access. No more dropping everything to be there like before. If she calls, I answer if I feel like it. If she texts, I don't rush to respond. I take my time. This isn't about revenge. It's about self-preservation. And now I ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have left like I did? Or would you have fought to keep a family that no longer wanted you? Because I won't lie, I've asked myself that same question. Was I weak for leaving? A coward for not fighting harder? What would you have done?